Okay, this is an overview of research methods in health psychology with particular attention to epidemiology, because epidemiology is not an area that most people who have studied psychology have a background in. Um, I certainly was not aware of a lot of the research methods and also approaches to statistics using things like odds, ratios, and relative risks until I went back to school after getting a PhD in psychology and got a master's in public health. Um, but these are uh, the types of statistics and the types of methods that are often used in studying health and behavior. So I'm sure that the content of this slide is something you all know. One of the reasons I put it up there, though, is that while this is sort of the gold standard in psychology for research and also for making causal statements, um, we often do not meet this standard, in fact, rarely meet this standard in health psychology research and epidemiology in the real world. Um, Again, just to remind you, if there are characteristics of people that may affect the outcome of a particular study, randomization should take care of that problem by putting an equal number of people with that characteristic, say women versus men, in both groups. So, for example, if you're studying smoking and smoking cessation, we know that persons with a high school education or below are more likely to be smokers and more likely to be heavy smokers. But if we randomly assigned a large group of people, education levels should equal out between the two groups if random assignment is used. So I think I've already answered this question, but the other aspect of this is the kinds of questions that we're particularly interested in, particularly applications to the real world, um, often cannot be studied with tight experimental controls in a laboratory setting. So one of the things we rely on are quasi-experiments, experiments in which some aspects of the study can be controlled and other aspects, frankly, cannot. This is looking at Flint, Michigan, and looking at lead levels. As you may know, with the Great Flint water crisis, the basis of it was that Flint changed its water source from the Detroit River to the Flint River. And you can see when you look at pre and post and look at lead levels in the Flint population that those that particularly the third group, when the water source changed, there was a big jump in the lead levels among those in particular areas of Flint. Now, I'll give you one example of a true experiment because I think this one's interesting and it's relevant. Um, One of the big questions has been whether or not physicians treat people differently based on characteristics such as race and gender. Um, while you could attempt to study something like this with random assignment, it would be difficult to do it in a clinical setting where health decisions were being made. However, these very creative people set up an analog study, and what they did was the researchers attended the American Academy of Cardiology's annual conference and signed up cardiologists to participate and did the study there. And what they did was they presented these pictures as well as the clinical histories, laboratory test results on these uh, surrogate or artificial patients. And what they were manipulating was gender and race to see if those influenced the cardiologist's decisions about care. This group, as evident, they're all white, and there's equal number of males and females. Again, these were analogs. These were not real patients, but the data that they used and asked the cardiologist to make decisions based on was the type of clinical data, again, test results, clinical histories, things like that, that are used in real life to make those kinds of decisions. Here is the other group. Again, equal number of males and females, but all African American. So and incidentally, what they did was they gave pretty much identical clinical histories and test results for all patients, and then asked the cardiologist what they would do in terms of additional testing or intervention. So, women on the whole were less likely to be referred for more extensive testing and for any kind of cardiac procedures like angioplasty. Compared with whites, African American patients were less likely to be referred. So both gender and race influenced how aggressive treatment would be for these patients. Okay. Now, if you ask cardiologists, do they treat men and women differently? They might acknowledge that with women, because there's some personality characteristics, psychological characteristics that may be more common among women, that they are less likely to refer them for more extensive cardiac evaluation and implicitly conclude that among women, cardiac symptoms, tightness in the chest, perhaps difficulty breathing, lightheadedness, that kind of stuff, may be more likely to be due to emotional factors. Yeah. That's a harder sell when you look at the differences based on race, and it suggests again that physicians do implicitly take factors like race into account when making treatment decisions. Now, I will say that the difference between the two groups was not huge, but they had a large enough sample that it was statistically significant. And again, if you asked physicians, do you treat black and white patients differently? overtly, most would say no. Okay, epidemiology. Now, one of the big differences in epidemiology and psychological research as we know it is psychological research, well, we use summary statistics like means and standard deviations and all that kind of stuff, really are trying to make inferences about individuals. Epidemiology focuses on populations rather than individuals. Um, and as we know, who gets sick um, is something that is not randomly assigned. It just occurs. We can't control it experimentally. The other thing that's different is that in epidemiology, you're often reasoning backwards. People already have the illness, the outcome, but you want to find out what's causing it. Probably one of the more common applied situations that comes up is cases of food poisoning. So all of a sudden, 10 to 15 patients show up at War Memorial's emergency department with nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, other symptoms associated with food poisoning. Okay. Um, and the objective is to find out what these people have in common. We also use terms prevalence and incidence. We use prevalence in psychopathology research, but incidence we don't use as much. And prevalence is the number of the percentage of people with a condition at a given time. So right now, for example, slightly over 50% of residents of the state of Michigan would be considered overweight or obese by preset standards, namely body mass index figures. The incidence is a percentage of people who develop a condition in a time period. Um, this is important for epidemics, and incidence data were often reported during COVID-19. How many patients, new percentage of patients, have contracted the illness in the past month? When incidence is on the rise, obviously you get very concerned. A couple examples. I'm going to give you a couple food poisoning examples because, again, these are the ones that often do occur in the real world and um, often used as examples in public health. Okay, so all of a sudden, folks started showing up at hospital emergency rooms in Minneapolis with food poisoning that was attributed to salmonella. Now, we usually associate salmonella poisoning with things like undercooked chicken. Um, in this situation, that was not the culprit. When they tracked down what all these patients had in common was that they all attended the Ecuadorian festival. These were people who came to the United States from Ecuador in South America, attended an Ecuadorian festival, and interestingly, at the Ecuadorian festival, they had guinea pig meat. Guinea pigs are considered a delicacy in Ecuador. So they found that everybody who got sick had been to the festival and had eaten guinea pig, which apparently was undercooked. Here's another interesting case. These were folks in North Carolina, and initially they didn't know what the cause of the food poisoning was. You can see that over 100 people got sick. Now, when they tracked down and looked very specifically at who got sick, staff people, people who work there, versus in-state residents, and because it was associated with a hotel chain, out-of-state residents. you can see that the cases increased pretty significantly and peaked around the 9th of May. They declined somewhat, but still remained well above the level they should be. So the health department, obviously, after all these cases occurred, paid the Holiday Inn a visit and concluded that the temperature of the dishwasher had been set too low and was not cleaning the dishes thoroughly. So they got rid of that dishwasher, got a new one, and you can see that the cases then declined. For those of you who have not taken public health, let me give you short of a background of this gentleman, because he's actually considered the founder of epidemiology. Dr. Snow was actually an anesthesiologist in London in the 1800s. And there were outbreaks of cholera. This is something we don't see very much in developed countries anymore. It's usually associated with poor sanitation and water contamination, oftentimes with human feces and things like that. But at the time, Snow and his physician colleagues did not have any conception of germ theory. And actually, the prevailing view was that something called miasma, bad air, caused disease. And there was some, I guess, reason to make that association, because the regions of London that had more illness were regions in which, if you walked into them, the smell was certainly noteworthy. Now, at this time, hygienic measures were less than optimal, to say the least. People threw their garbage in the streets. They had outhouses or chamber pots, and a major source both of water for drinking and everything else, as well as a major dump site, was the Thames River. So people were getting their water from the Thames River in London, but also the Thames River was incredibly polluted. All runoff, people dumped their household waste in it. There were dead animals floating in it. Pretty nasty. So this is a map, the little blue dots indicating where there were cases of cholera. And if you want to watch some of the videos on Snow, there they are. I'll try to remember to post the links independently to the website. So again, as I mentioned before, cholera does still exist in developing countries, and it's a pretty nasty way to go out, because people get dehydrated very quickly. They're primarily having diarrhea, terrible diarrhea. They call it's rice-like diarrhea, and that it has the consistency apparently of rice and is very, very also fluid-based. And when John Snow was doing his research, he found that the cases of cholera in London were all from the same general area. So the question becomes, what do these people share in common? That's actually an original map, and each of those little rectangles represents a case of cholera. And I think that one with a very large number was like a boarding house. Now you'll notice that while the association is not perfect, there does seem to be an association between cases of cholera and the proximity to the main water pump. This is how people got their water at the time. They didn't have indoor plumbing, so there were centralized water pumps throughout the city. This is again another map. The blue represents the water pump. This pump doesn't have a handle. And that was Snow's intervention. He removed the handle from the Broad Street pump, and the cases of cholera declined. Again, this was at a time when germ theory was not established. So it was concluded there was something in the water that was contributing to these cases, but it wasn't known specifically. But I think Snow's pioneering work in this area kind of shows you how epidemiology is done as a sort of detective work. And Snow is considered the founder of modern epidemiology. Now, some other ways that research is done in health and healthcare are prospective studies. These are tough to do. These are longitudinal studies. And the reason they're important in health is that there's oftentimes a significant lag between the thing that is causing the disease or the exposure and the illness itself. Let me give you an example. Exposure to ultraviolet light, particularly use of tanning beds. We know that exposure to tanning beds and high exposure to ultraviolet light are associated with skin cancer. However, again, the skin cancer oftentimes does not appear till perhaps 10 to 20 years later. The same is often true with smoking. People are smoking today and may have been smoking for the past 10 years, but the cancer may not show up till 20 years from now. So making causal statements, smoking causes lung cancer, is difficult. Well, one of the ways you can do this is to engage in what are called prospective studies. Again, these are quasi-experiments because they have some experimental controls, but not everything. So one of the best known that has been ongoing, I think, for now up to 70 years, is the Framingham Heart Study in Framingham, Massachusetts. A lot of what we know about cardiovascular risk factors comes from this study. Framingham is a medium-sized town, but it's good for research purposes for several reasons. One, people don't move very much, so you're not going to lose parts of your sample. Also, in terms of determining outcomes, like who has heart disease and who does not, people almost always use a common local hospital. And so our information about the role of cholesterol, diet, for example, in heart disease often is based upon data gathered as part of the Framingham Heart Study. Framingham is again, it's in Massachusetts, medium-sized town. Here's another one. I think this was done kind of creatively. The Mediterranean diet. Is it really that good for your health? Well, how do you study something like this? Well, one of the things that they did was they had people, again, sort of randomly, they weren't randomly assigned, but they had people who complied with the Mediterranean diet, and they kept a food log every day. And then they turned the food log into the researchers, and the researchers were able to score it according to how much the person's food intake resembled the standard. And what they found was that with about 3 to 4 years of the Mediterranean diet, heart disease risk was reduced, mortality rates were reduced, cholesterol was reduced. So, reasonably good evidence that this diet is pretty healthy. Here is an example of a retrospective study, and it's along the lines that we've talked about with sort of detective work in epidemiology. This is from the early 1900s. A group of young women developed these pronounced cancerous tumors. They also had significant dental problems, usually losing their teeth. And again, a number of these women died before the age of 30, which was unusual. So, from the perspective of epidemiology, what did these women have in common? Well, the way that you do this is that you match each case, each person who has a condition, with a control person. So you would look to find women who are of similar age and social background who did not develop the illness. And because these women who developed the illness were all employed, you would look for a control group of women, same age, etc., who were employed in a different area. Yeah. And usually when you're doing this retrospectively, you're looking at whatever health records you can get and also interviews about kinds of exposures that these folks may have had in the past. Well, did the cases have anything in common? Well, one, they were nearly all women. Two, they were pretty young. And they shared the same occupation. They were painting luminous dials on clocks and watches to make them glow in the dark. This was an attractive thing at the time. And they all sat at little cubicles like that. And it was also thought that young women had particularly good fine motor skills. So that was the other reason that they were often enlisted for this kind of work. There are examples of the luminous dials. Well, how did this luminous effect get produced? Well, it got produced because the women were using radioactive paint that was deliberately made to be radioactive so that you would get this glowing effect. And many times the women, again, to help do some of the more fine motor type of work when painting these luminous dials, would put the end of the brush in their mouth to get it wet, then put it back in the paint, etc. Um, and so this is sometimes also called an ex post facto design because you have the illness and you're looking backwards. One interesting study in this regard, and if you watch TV late at night, you will find oftentimes ads from attorneys looking for people who develop mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a rare type of lung cancer, and that is a photograph of a lung damaged by mesothelioma. It seems to disproportionately affect men. And originally people thought it might be due to smoking. But they concluded later that the type of lung cancer that smokers developed was different than mesothelioma. So what distinguished those with and without the condition? In this case, the men all worked with asbestos. And asbestos, that's like a particle board of asbestos. Little pieces flake off and they can get into your lungs. Also, they found higher rates of mesothelioma among the women who are married to and children of asbestos workers. Again, it was believed that probably they brought some of this asbestos home on their clothing, for example, or it was in their hair. And family members indirectly inhaled it. Um, Today, this is very well established, the association between asbestos and mesothelioma. But up and through the 1950s at least, asbestos was commonly used in homes. Older homes, you'll see it used to wrap water pipes, oftentimes. I lived in an older home that had it, for some reason, embedded in the tiles of the basement floor. And removing this stuff, because it's so hazardous, is a costly and involved process. People in these spacesuit-like things come in to remove it. But it's very common, and it's likely to be found in a lot of older homes around the United States. Okay, here's another case, perhaps more disturbing. There was an outbreak of HIV. This was before we had PrEP and some of the other medications that reduce the transmission. And through contact tracing, they found that all of the cases had had sexual contact with this gentleman. He was HIV positive, but did not inform his partners, which incidentally is illegal. I think I've made this point already, but I'll belabor it a bit. Very similar to psychology, where we say that there's an association or there's a correlation. In epidemiology, oftentimes the best we can do is say that two things seem to go together, they're associated, they're correlated. The measures that we use in epidemiology are a little bit different than correlation coefficients. We use relative risks or odds ratios. So when you hear on the news that people who live near power lines were twice as likely to develop unusual cancers, this is a claim that is based upon statistics like odds ratios or relative risks. Again, RCTs, randomized clinical trials, certainly are the best evidence of causality, but we don't have that. So how do we make conclusions like asbestos causes mesothelioma or cigarette smoking causes lung cancer? How do we know that? How do we know that drinking alcohol during pregnancy results in something called fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol effects, which there's cognitive impairment and sometimes physical problems among babies and children whose mothers consumed alcohol during pregnancy? How do we know that? Well, Sir Bradford Hill and his colleague Sir Richard Dahl were the major players in establishing the association between lung cancer and smoking in the 1950s. And again, because the time delay between smoking and the development of lung cancer is pretty pronounced, and there's a number of things you can't control. How can you make causal statements when basically what you have data-wise, numerically, are not statistics that lead you to infer a cause, but only the two things are associated? So this is his list And I'm going to go through these. The more of these that are present, the greater the likelihood that a relationship is causal. So this shows the lag time between cigarette smoking, initiating smoking, and the development of lung cancer. You can see it's on the average probably around 20 years or so. Well, one factor is in the list is the dose response effect. If this smoking is a factor, people who smoke more cigarettes, heavier smokers, should be at greater risk for lung cancer. And you see that that is the case. People who smoked 40 to 50 cigarettes a day were more likely to develop lung cancer than those smoking 30 or fewer. Biological plausibility. Is there a mechanism, biologically speaking, chemically speaking, that is reasonable and that could account for this association? There is evidence that exposure to tars, which are in cigarettes, um, does cause cellular mutations. And one of the studies that they did was with rabbits, and I'll come back to it in just a minute, that did show that this process was occurring. Again, here's dose response example. This is looking at the relationship between hypertension and what's called pre-hypertension, and the development of heart disease later in life. And you can see that the higher the level, blood pressure levels, systolic specifically, the greater the likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease.